Watch the water. Right now, somewhere on this planet, it is rising. In the autumn of 2025, rivers that had behaved for 1,000 years climbed over their banks and swallowed streets, cars, entire neighborhoods. In the spring of 2026, storms that meteorologists called once in a generation arrived for the third time in 5 years. Coastlines are being redrawn, insurance maps are being torn up and printed again, and all across the world, in quiet moments, people are asking the same old question their ancestors asked under the same darkening sky. What if the water does not stop? What if this is the beginning of the next great flood? You have heard the story before. You think you know it. A righteous man, an ark, two of every animal. A wicked world washed clean because mankind had sinned. It is one of the most famous stories ever told, carried in the Book of Genesis across 3,000 years and into nearly every home on earth. But here is what almost no one tells you. That story is not the original. It is a copy, and buried in the older version, pressed into wet clay more than 1,000 years before a single word of Genesis was written. There is a reason for the flood, a reason the later tellers quietly left out, a reason that has nothing to do with sin, and once you hear it, you may never look at the rising water the same way again. Let me show you something first. In the year 1929, in the deserts of southern Iraq, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was digging into a hill that had once been the great Sumerian city of Ur. He was tunneling down through layer after layer of human history, pottery, walls, the bones of kings, the gold of a lost civilization. Then his workers hit something that made no sense. Beneath the city, beneath all of it, they struck a thick band of clean river silt, pure mud, more than 2.5 meters of it, deposited by water, containing nothing, no pottery, no tools, no trace of human life. A dead zone. And then below that sterile flood layer, the picks struck the pottery and the hearths of an even older people, a civilization that had lived and been buried under water and been forgotten before the city above it was ever built. Woolley sent a telegram home. The wording was famously simple. We have found the flood. Now scholars debate to this day whether that silt layer was a single biblical-scale deluge or one of many catastrophic local floods that battered the Mesopotamian plain. That debate is real, and it matters, and we will be honest about it. But stand in that trench for a moment. Imagine the people who lived in the world below the mud. To them, the flood was not a metaphor. It was the end of everything they knew, and it was real enough to leave a scar in the earth you can still touch today. Now travel north, to the Black Sea. In the late 1990s, 2 geologists from Columbia University, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, proposed something that sounded like myth dressed as science. They argued that around 5,600 BC, the Mediterranean Sea, swollen by melting ice, finally broke through the narrow land barrier at the Bosphorus. The water did not trickle in, it roared. They calculated a torrent that may have poured through at a force many times greater than Niagara Falls, day after day, for months, turning a quiet freshwater lake into the salt sea we know today, drowning thousands of square kilometers of inhabited shoreline, whole communities gone, survivors scattering in every direction, carrying with them one searing memory: the day the sea came over the world. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis is still argued among scientists. Some of the evidence supports it, some complicates it, and honesty demands we say so. But notice the pattern. Everywhere we dig at the foundations of civilization, in the silt of Ur, in the drowned valleys of the Black Sea, in the meltwater chaos at the end of the last ice age, we find the same shape pressing up through the earth. Water, catastrophe, a world that ended, and a handful who survived to remember. So when the most ancient peoples on earth wrote down a flood story, they were not inventing a fairy tale. They were recording the worst thing that had ever happened to them. And the oldest of those records, older than the Bible, older than the kings of Israel, older than the Hebrew language itself, was waiting in a museum drawer for someone to read it. When they did, the reason it gave for the flood was not the reason you were taught. To understand what they found, you have to understand who the Sumerians were. 5,500 years ago, in the marshy land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, a people we call the Sumerians did something no one had ever done. They built the first true cities. They invented writing. wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay with a cut reed. The script we call cuneiform. They wrote down everything: receipts, laws, love poems, lists of kings, and their gods. The Sumerians believed the world was governed by a council of powerful beings: Anu, the distant sky father; Enlil, the lord of wind and storm, and the king of the gods on earth; and Enki, also called Ea, the cunning god of fresh water and wisdom, the one who, again and again, took the side of humankind. Keep those two names close: Enlil and Enki, the one who would order the flood, and the one who would betray that order to save us. Their flood story survives in not one document, but several, written across more than 1,000 years and 3 civilizations, and the most important of them is a poem we call the Atrahasis Epic. Its name means exceedingly wise, and it is the name of its hero, the Sumerian and Babylonian Noah, the man who built the boat. The most complete copies we have were written in the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BC. Read that date again: 1700 years before Christ, centuries before the Hebrew Bible was composed. The scribe who wrote the best surviving version even signed and dated his work, the way you might sign a letter. This is not legend whispered around a fire. This is a dated, physical document sitting in the British Museum that you could go and look at this week. And the Atrahasis Epic does something the Bible never does. It begins before mankind even exists. It opens with a complaint, not from humans but from the gods themselves. But Atrahasis is not the only witness. There is an even older thread, written in the original Sumerian language itself, that scholars call the Eridu Genesis. Eridu was believed by the Sumerians to be the very first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven before the flood. And in that fragmentary Sumerian poem, the survivor has a different name, not Atrahasis, not Noah, but Zia-Sudra, which means life of long days, the one who, after the waters fell, was granted something no other mortal would ever receive: eternal life. The Sumerian king lists, those dry administrative records of who ruled and for how long, draw a single hard line through their own history, and that line is the flood. There are the kings before the flood, who reigned for impossible spans of thousands of years, and then comes a sentence, repeated across these ancient documents like a scar. Then the flood swept over, and after it, a new and shorter age of men. To the Sumerians, the deluge was not just a story, it was the dividing line of all history, the before and the after. Their entire sense of time was split in two by the rising of the water. And so we have 3 voices, across 3 civilizations and 1,000 years, telling the same flood: the Sumerian Zia-Sudra of the Eridu Genesis, the Babylonian Atrahasis, and the survivor of the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh, a man called Utnapishtim. 3 names, 1 memory, and each of them, in their own way, points back to the same strange beginning: gods who made us to work and turned against us when we became too many. Here is the mystery I want you to hold on to as we go deeper. In the Bible, the flood is punishment. The world had become wicked, and a just God washed it clean. Cause and effect, sin and judgment. It is a moral story, and we understand moral stories. But the older tablet, the one written 1,000 years earlier, gives a reason so strange, so unsettling, so unlike anything you were raised to expect, that the first scholars who translated it must have read the lines twice to be sure. The gods did not flood the world because humanity was evil. They flooded it for something else entirely. And to see why, we have to go back to the very beginning of the story, back to before the first man drew breath. The Atrahasis Epic opens in a strange and almost recognizable scene. The gods, it says, were doing all the work. The lesser gods, the laboring class of the divine, had been forced to dig the great rivers and canals of the world by hand, hauling earth in baskets for thousands of years, and they were exhausted. They were furious. One night, they burned their tools, surrounded the house of Enlil, and went on strike, a rebellion in heaven, over labor. And so the gods came up with a solution. They would create a new kind of being to carry the burden for them. They would make a worker. They would make man. The wise god Enki and the mother goddess mixed clay with the blood of a slain god, and from that mixture they shaped humanity, created, the text says plainly, to bear the toil of the gods, to do the digging, to free the divine from their labor. Sit with that for a second. In the oldest written account of why we exist, humanity was not made in love and not made for glory. We were made to work, to carry someone else's burden. That is the foundation the whole flood story is built upon, and you must remember it because it explains everything that comes next. Because at first the plan worked beautifully. Mankind labored, the canals were dug, the fields were watered, and humanity, freed by its own usefulness, did the one thing the gods had not planned for. It thrived, it multiplied. The people grew numerous beyond counting, and their cities spread across the plain, and with all those millions of human lives came something the gods had never had to endure before: sound. The text is astonishing here, and I want to be precise, because this is the heart of everything. The Atrahasis Epic says that the land had become wide, the people had become numerous, and the land was bellowing like a wild bull. The god Enlil was disturbed by the uproar of mankind. Their noise, the clamor of all those teeming human lives, rose up to heaven, and Enlil could not sleep. Read that again, slowly. Not their sin, not their cruelty, not their wickedness, their noise, their numbers. Mankind had become too many and too loud, and the king of the gods, lying awake in heaven, decided that something had to be done about it. This is not a fringe reading. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is the plain, accepted, mainstream translation of the text, taught in universities, printed in the standard scholarly editions by the great Assyriologists, who decoded the language. The reason the gods first turned against humanity, in the oldest flood story we possess, was overpopulation and noise, the disturbance of divine rest, an annoyance. And what Enlil did next tells you exactly how the makers of this story imagined their makers. Enlil did not go straight to the flood. First, he tried something quieter. He sent a plague, a wasting sickness swept across mankind to thin the human herd. But Enki, the wise one, the friend of humanity, whispered to a man called Atrahasis, and told him how to make it stop, and the plague was turned back. So Enlil tried again. He sent drought. He commanded the skies to hold back their rain, and the earth to lock away its grain, until the fields cracked and the people starved. The text describes the famine in unbearable detail, faces growing dark, the people stooping, the slow horror of a world running out of food. And again, Enki found a way to save them. Twice the king of the gods tried to quietly reduce the number of human beings, the way you might cull a population that had grown inconvenient, and twice he was thwarted.
Stop and feel the weight of that.
The flood, when it finally comes, is not a first resort. It is not a sudden burst of righteous anger. It is the final solution after plague and famine failed. It is methodical. It is, in the coldest possible sense, a population control measure that escalated until it became total. The gods did not lose their temper with a wicked world. They ran out of patience with a successful one. And so, at last, Enlil called the council of the gods together, and he made them swear a terrible oath. This time there would be no half measures. This time they would send a flood, a deluge to wipe the surface of the earth clean of humankind entirely, to silence the noise forever. And he bound every god to secrecy. Not one of them was to warn the humans. Mankind was to be erased without ever knowing why. But there was Enki. There was always Enki. Now here is where the storyteller does something brilliant, something that tells you these were not simple people. Enki had sworn the oath too. He could not break it directly. He could not speak to a human and warn him. So he found a loophole, and the loophole is one of the cleverest moments in all of ancient literature. Enki went to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, the wall of the hut where the man slept, and he did not speak to the man. He spoke to the wall. He whispered his warning to the reeds, knowing the man was listening on the other side. Wall, listen to me, he says. Reed hut, pay attention. And through the wall, to the man who was not officially being told anything at all, Enki gave the instructions that would save the human race. Tear down your house. Build a boat. Abandon your possessions and save your life. Reject wealth and keep what breathes alive. Build a vessel and seal it, and bring aboard the seed of all living things. And the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh describes the flood itself with a terror that no later retelling ever matched. When the storm came, Utnapishtim says, even the gods were afraid of it. The god of storms rode the tempest, and the dikes broke, and a darkness rose, so total that the gods themselves fled up to the highest heaven and cowered there like dogs, crouching against the outer wall. The mother goddess, who had helped make mankind, wept and cried out that she had given birth to her people, only to see them fill the sea, like the spawn of fish. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind and the flood flattened the world, and when it finally stilled, Utnapishtim opened a hatch, and light fell on his face, and he looked out, and all of mankind had turned back to clay. Every human being, silent. The noise that had so disturbed the gods was gone at last, and the silence was so complete that it broke the heart of the very God who had ordered it. That is the scene the Sumerian and Babylonian scribes preserved, and it is from that exact account that the more familiar version was later shaped. Does that sound familiar? It should, because more than 1,000 years later, in the book of Genesis, a god would tell a man named Noah to build a vessel, to seal it with pitch, to bring aboard the living things of the earth, and to ride out a flood that would cover the world. The parallels are not vague. They are exact, point by point. The divine warning, the boat, the sealing, the animals, the flood, the landing on a mountain, and then, and this detail will haunt you, the birds. In the Babylonian story of Utnapishtim, the survivor sends out a dove, and it returns, finding no place to land. Then a swallow, and it returns. Then a raven, and the raven does not come back, because the waters have receded, and the bird has found dry land. Now open your Bible to the story of Noah, and read it. A raven, a dove that returns, a dove sent again, the same birds, the same sequence, written 1,000 years apart. I want to pause here and be completely honest with you, because honesty is the whole point of this channel. The relationship between the Mesopotamian flood stories and the biblical one is not a wild claim made by people on the fringe. It is the mainstream scholarly consensus, accepted across the field. The texts are real, the dates are real. The Atrahasis Epic and the flood tablet of Gilgamesh genuinely predate the composition of Genesis by well over 1,000 years. The parallels in plot, in detail, in the very birds released from the Ark, are documented and undeniable. What scholars debate is the nature of the connection, whether the Hebrew writers borrowed directly, or whether both traditions drew from an older shared memory of catastrophe that flowed through the whole ancient Near East. That part is interpretation, and reasonable people differ, but the existence of the older texts and the difference in what they say is not interpretation. It is fact, pressed into clay you can hold in your hand, and the most important difference is the one we have been circling this entire time, the reason. Because here is the truth of it. When the Hebrew writers told the flood story, they kept the boat, they kept the animals, they kept the birds, the mountain, the survivor, and his family. But they changed the why. They took a story in which the gods drowned humanity because it was too numerous and too loud, an irritation to divine sleep, and they transformed it into a story in which a single god drowned humanity because the earth had filled with violence and the heart of man had turned to evil continually. They took an act of cosmic annoyance and made it an act of moral justice. They gave the flood a conscience, and in doing so, they quietly buried the older reason, the strange, cold, unsettling reason, so deep that for nearly 3,000 years, almost no one knew it had ever existed, until 1872. In that year, a self-taught British scholar named George Smith was sitting in the British Museum, sorting through broken fragments of clay tablets that had been hauled out of the ruins of the library of an Assyrian king at Nineveh. He was reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great Babylonian poem of a king's search for immortality, when he reached its 11th tablet, and the words on that broken clay made him stop breathing. There, in a language dead for 2,000 years, was a flood, a man told by a god to build a boat, the waters rising, the vessel coming to rest on a mountain, the birds sent out one by one. It was the flood of Noah, but older and not Hebrew, and not from the Bible at all. The story goes that George Smith, in his excitement, began to undress in the reading room of the museum, so overcome was he by what he had found. He had discovered after 3,000 years of silence, the original, And when the full account was finally pieced together from Atrahasis and Gilgamesh and the older Sumerian Eridu Genesis, the world had to face a quiet, enormous fact. The most famous story in the Bible had a grandfather, and the grandfather told it differently. Now let us go even further back than the texts, because the human memory of the flood may reach deeper than any tablet. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended, and it did not end gently. Geologists describe a period called the Younger Dryas and the warming that followed it, when the great ice sheets that had buried the northern world for tens of thousands of years began to collapse. Seas rose not by centimeters, but by more than 100 meters over the following millennia. Vast lakes of glacial meltwater, dammed behind walls of ice, burst and emptied across continents in floods of unimaginable scale. Coastlines the size of countries vanished beneath the waves. The land bridges that connected continents drowned. This is not speculation. This is the documented climate history of our species. Every human being alive at the end of the Ice Age watched the water rise across their lifetimes, generation after generation, swallowing the world of their grandparents. Is it any wonder that the oldest stories of every culture on Earth, from Mesopotamia to India to the Americas, remember a great flood? And in the very heart of this drowned, transforming world, on a hilltop in what is now southern Turkey, there sits a monument that should not exist. Göbekli Tepe, massive stone pillars, carved with animals and strange figures, arranged in great rings by people who had no metal, no writing, no cities, no pottery. Hunter-gatherers, raising temples of stone 11,500 years ago, at the very dawn of the age of floods. We do not fully understand why they built it. We do not know what they believed, but we know this. Even then, even at the beginning, human beings were looking up at the sky and out at the changing world and building something to make sense of forces far larger than themselves. The instinct that produced the flood tablets was already ancient before the tablets were ever made. The fear was already in us, so let us return now to the heart of the matter, and let me deliver the full weight of what that oldest tablet actually says, because you have earned it. According to the Atrahasis Epic, the oldest complete flood narrative humanity possesses, written more than 1,000 years before Genesis, the gods did not destroy the world for sin. They created human beings to be a labor force, to dig their canals and bear their burdens. And when those human beings did exactly what living things do, when they multiplied and flourished and filled the world with the sound of their lives, the gods experienced that flourishing, not as a triumph, but as a nuisance. The earth bellowed, the noise rose up. The king of the gods could not rest, and so he resolved to reduce the human population, first by plague, then by famine, and finally, when those failed, by a flood meant to erase mankind from the earth entirely. It was not judgment, it was management. The makers looked at their creation, saw that it had become too numerous and too loud, and decided to cull it. Think about what that reveals about how these ancient people imagined the powers above them, not as a loving father, not as a righteous judge, but as something more distant and more frightening, beings who valued their own comfort above the survival of an entire species, who saw humanity not as children to be corrected, but as a population to be controlled, an experiment that had grown inconvenient. And think about what it reveals about those people themselves, that they could look at the gods they worshipped, the gods who had tried 3 times to wipe them out, and still tell the story honestly. They did not flatter their makers. They wrote down the cold truth as they understood it. We were made to serve. We grew too many. They tried to thin us, and only the mercy of one rebel god, Enki, whispering to a wall, kept the human race alive. And now, look up from the tablet. Look at the world outside your window, a planet of more than 8 billion people, more numerous than any generation in the history of our species, cities that never sleep and never fall silent, a constant roar of engines and voices and machines, a noise that truly does rise up off the surface of the earth without pause. And the water is rising again, the ice is melting again, the seas are climbing again, the storms are arriving with a frequency that frightens the people whose job it is to measure them. We are, in the most literal terms the ancient scribes would have recognized, a world grown too numerous and too loud, watching the water rise. The Sumerians would have understood this moment perfectly. They wrote the warning into clay 4,000 years ago. The land has become wide, the people have become numerous, the land is bellowing like a wild bull, and someone, somewhere above, or within the system that governs all things, may be growing tired of the noise. That is not a prophecy. I will not tell you the gods are coming, or that the flood is fated, because I do not know that, and neither does anyone who is honest with you. What I will tell you is this. The oldest story we have ever written about the end of the world was not, at its root, a story about how bad we are. It was a story about how many we are, and how loud, and how little the powers that shaped us seemed to care whether we survived. The Bible gave the flood a moral. The older tablet gave it a motive. And the motive was us, simply too much of us, simply existing, simply making the sound that living things make. That is the reason the later tellers could not quite bring themselves to keep. That is the reason the Bible quietly let drift to the bottom of the silt, where it lay until a man in a museum read the 11th tablet of Gilgamesh and forgot how to breathe. Now you know what the older story really says. Now you know the real reason, the documented reason, the reason pressed into clay 1,000 years before Genesis was ever written. The flood was not punishment for what we did. It was a response to what we are. If this is the kind of truth you want, the real texts, the real archaeology, the buried versions of the stories you only thought you knew, then subscribe to Sumerian Vault and stay close. Because this is exactly what we do here. We go back to the original tablets, before the copies, before the comfortable retellings, and we read what they actually say. There are more of these stories waiting in the clay than you can imagine, and we are only beginning to open them. But before you go, sit with one last question, because the Atrahasis Epic does not end with the flood. It ends with the gods discovering to their horror that humanity had survived, and with them deciding what to do about us afterward. They did not try to drown us again. Instead, the text says, they invented new and quieter ways to keep our numbers in check. New limits, new forms of death and loss woven permanently into human life, so that we would never again grow numerous enough to disturb their rest. The flood, it turns out, was not the end of the gods' campaign against our numbers. It was only the loudest chapter. So here is the question I want you to carry until next time. If the makers in the oldest story decided that drowning us was too crude, and chose instead to build the limits quietly into the fabric of our very existence, then what exactly did they decide to leave inside us? And are we still living under those terms today? The tablet has an answer, and next time we are going to read it.